thanks to you all, but thanks in particular to our guest today. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm Christopher Schroeder. I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees of the German Marshall Fund. For someone who's followed the development of foreign policy for years, it really is a particular honor for us at GMF to have this event with Erin McKee, who you all know is the Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. It's been an opportunity to emphasize the importance of USAID and the transformative impact that you guys have achieved. So thank you again. The recognition that USAID plays a central role for U.S. foreign policy is not only that it was given a seat in the National Security Council, which is not nothing, but it is really, I think, and we were talking about this earlier, in your deeds on the ground, the countless partnerships you developed across sectors, very much bottom up, which so many of us, and I think around the world, deeply cherish and have such a clear and measurable impact that's tangible. We here at GMF are inspired by the mission that animates USAID and the mission that increasingly defines how America positions itself around a rapidly changing world. Given the unprecedented threats facing our security and prosperity, it is particularly encouraging to see that USAID is compatible with and can be a useful instrument for many of the objectives of the President-elect. I think he's articulated those clearly. While the question of future U.S. support for Ukraine remains open, we have no doubts that there is a groundswell of support and recognition across both parties here in the United States that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of the values that we all share. These are the values of democracy and rule of law that delivers. It's about results, and it's about ensuring security and prosperity that comes from this. The governance and economic prospects we collectively offer and can catalyze, thanks to your joint investments, deliver results for people and starkly contrasts with those of our global, shall we say, competitors. Erin, just as a quick note about you, you've just been a tremendous power in making a profound difference with and for the Ukrainians and making American dollars go further, also elsewhere across Europe and Eurasia. We thank you for your service. We thank you for your partnership with us, and congratulations on you for doing such important work and to your team. So with that, Josh, it's all yours.
To have such a distinguished guest and introduction from GMF's chair of the Board of Trustees. That's how we salute with our biggest gun. And I, on the other hand, am Josh Rudolph, head of GMF's Ukraine Reform Working Group, among other strategic democracy initiatives. This event is on the record, video recorded, will be posted online later. There will be a Q&A towards the end. And our guest, again, is Ambassador Erin McKee, who spent the past 3 years serving as USAID Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia after an illustrious career as a Foreign Service Officer, managing USAID programs in late 90s Russia, Middle East, South America, Central Asia, head of several offices and bureaus in Washington, mission director in Jakarta. Erin then earned the special distinction of being one of the few select FSOs who rise to the rank of U.S. ambassador to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and having served as a political appointee under both Republicans and Democrats, and serving in the senior foreign service at the rank of career minister, and approaching her work with a serious national security perspective. Erin could not fit more naturally with GMF's nonpartisan approach to all issues, and especially support for Ukraine. We will focus today on the work that you've led, Erin, since Russia's full-scale invasion, a war that, of course, means that Ukraine needs all the help it can get, but it also means that Kyiv and all of the United States' partners and allies need all of the tools and resources they can get to counter the other side of the Kremlin's hybrid warfare toolkit, malign foreign influence, the 4 channels of corruption, information, energy, and economic coercion. We'll come back to that, I'm sure, because it is your response to that problem set that's why, if we had to boil it down for one reason, why you've been the right leader in the right time and place, having that experience to be on guard for malign foreign influence. And, like we said, having come up through the Foreign Service, the experience to turn the wheels of government to then build a strategic framework for rooting out malign influence and working with local partners to build democracy, security, and prosperity. So my first question is about that framework, about the strengthening the foundations of freedom, the four pillars that counter malign influence and build something better. If you could kind of share with us about how that part of USAID's work has guided the work in Europe and Eurasia, and especially in the context of Ukraine's resilience being of paramount national security.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's always humbling to hear others describe everything that you've done, but I couldn't have been more honored and privileged to have had this role during this critical time and on sort of our strategic approach throughout the region in Europe and Eurasia after I was confirmed by the Senate, fastest confirmation since World War II. So the bipartisan recognition of the importance of this moment has carried through. And so I had to hustle, was unprepared to leave my ambassadorial post so quickly, but was very grateful that I was able to do so. And we had been working on countering malign influence, but after the full-scale invasion, what my team and I immediately recognized was that we needed to go on offense, that reacting to the problem set and Putin's predatory behavior, as well as all of the other key areas there, the value proposition that USAID and development brought and could bring to the region needed to be more intentional and focused. And so instead of countering malign Kremlin influence, and let's be very clear, while Putin's the most obvious malign actor, particularly in Ukraine, but in the region, we had state-sponsored cyber attacks from Iran. We have the economic occupation or predatory economic activity from the PRC. It's a broader swath than just what's coming out of Moscow. And so we didn't change fundamentally our primary goals, but we changed our approach and focused on what we were doing right and what we had been doing right for the 3 decades that we've been working in the region, and really distilled it down to 4 things. 4 things that the United States prioritized across the board, but also what we heard as demand signals from the people of the countries where we were working, first and foremost, of course, Ukraine. So the first is democracy and governance. Building democracy, dismantling the political economy that was inherited under the Soviet Union or as part of the Soviet bloc was and is and remains work that must continue, so that every citizen has an opportunity to have faith in their government, have their voice be heard, and participate in the future that they see for Euro-Atlantic integration, and certainly not being subject to authoritarian or dictatorial rules, laws, frameworks that don't give them that choice or opportunity. The second objective, and so we do that in a variety, from rule of law to supporting civil society to sort of the traditional development work, but also in Europe and Eurasia, we had an outsized opportunity with the collapse of the Soviet Union to really get in on the ground floor and help these countries aspire to the future that they had fought so hard for when we saw the color revolutions and other things that weren't answering the mail after 89 and of course 91. The second, which isn't part of the democracy portfolio, it often is, but it wasn't part of the democracy portfolio in our strategy, and that is the information and media space. The fourth pillar of democracy, right? Sort of the fourth estate, if you will, on making sure that fact-based information, investigative journalism, if we look at combating corruption and being able to rely upon or have a choice about what you see, read, and are able to learn from the information space, which with technology and everything else had become a priority, but also weaponized in the hands of the malign actors. And so we needed to not just support independent media or ensure that investigative journalists had the tools and the support that they needed, but we also needed to get back to basics, and that is information literacy, the consumer side, working with both at the national level and the host countries where we work, but elsewhere, to reintroduce into curricula critical thinking and being able to discern or see BS when you see it and recognize it. That doesn't mean you don't have to believe it, but at least having that choice and knowing what's true and what's not. The third pillar, which is vital for Europe, and frankly, as we've seen, whether it's in Cuba or unfortunately even Puerto Rico and elsewhere, is energy security and energy independence. The Damocles sword that Putin was wielding over all of Europe, including Western Europe, but certainly first and foremost Ukraine, as he's weaponized winter. But as we saw, that blackmail and that threat of, particularly as winter approaches across Europe, was something that we've been working on for years in moving toward market-based, private sector, whether renewable or not, but getting particularly, for example, in the Balkans, off of coal and dependency on fossil fuel and looking at a blended or diversified energy generation sector, all with an eye towards European integration. So we work closely with our EU colleagues and ENSO-E, which is, sorry, I've been with government for so long, I don't even know what the acronym stands for. European National Transmission System Operators, E for electricity. There you go. I did remember it. To set up the regulatory and other elements that the countries needed to adopt as they moved towards diversifying their energy source, but also moving to a market base, which drives down prices and ultimately helps the consumers, which so many folks who had been subsidized during, whether it's the Soviet or elsewhere, that transition is painful, and working with the governments to help reduce that shock as they move towards something that is more sustainable and better for their future. So the energy sector is our third goal. And part of that is coupled with critical infrastructure. And so with the new strategy, when we went to the intentional sort of forward-leaning, was cybersecurity. And that's tied to the first, well, actually, we're not stovepiped. They're all integrated. As we moved on the democracy front and looking at e-governance and access to services and better information and digitization of so much of what the 21st century has to offer us, we needed to protect that information and boost citizen confidence in putting their information out there. Unfortunately, as we've seen, that makes countries vulnerable if they aren't prepared to protect at the same time. So with e-governance and digitization, you also need cybersecurity. So we, over a decade ago, started working both sides of the coin, and we're sort of ahead of the curve, which in the case of Ukraine served them extraordinarily well when the asymmetric warfare toolkit came out, in addition to the kinetic activity with a full-scale invasion. And then our fourth and final, and I think objective, is economic growth, prosperity, trade diversification, helping realize and unlock that full potential of partnership and the economic opportunity that we see not only with Europe, the EU accession and ultimately Euro-Atlantic integration, but to stop the brain drain. We see in so many of the countries that we're still working in that loss of their greatest asset, that human capital, because they don't see a future. They don't see jobs. They don't see how they can make, a plan for themselves, or even if they're, have young families, what they can bring for their kids. So to be able to deliver on that promise of investing in themselves so that they can stay in their home country and help their country invest in them for the future. And so it's the economic growth and prosperity agenda is more than just trade, more than just connectivity. It's also helping build that capability of our countries from Moldova to the Balkans to in the Caucasus and certainly in Ukraine to be able to help deliver on that promise of being able to provide for yourself, provide for your family, and nothing restores dignity or gives you that sense of true, this is what democracy can deliver for me, to be able to choose where you're going to work, how you're going to work and apply those skills and advance those skills and grow them even more. So those are our four primary goals. How they're applied and the programming that we do around it depends on the host country context. But they all, again, as I said, aren't a deviation for what we were doing before, but we saw it as the greatest value proposition that the United States had to offer to our partners in what we believe is a turning point in particularly U.S. and European partnerships.
Indeed. Well, thank you for that and for setting the table with that framework. Now let's talk about some of those applications in Ukraine, starting with the first pillar on governance, which I'll just frame for a minute here, because as an anti-corruption expert, most of us in the anti-corruption field have spent like a generation trying to get the development community to focus on corruption with the C word, rather than just governance per se. But we're in this weird situation with Ukraine of it being a bit flipped right now, because it is actually risky business trying to be corrupt in Ukraine these days. Together with USAID over a decade, Kyiv has built world-leading systems of transparency, decentralization, specialized anti-corruption agencies, restructured whole sectors of the economy. Those institutions are working during the war. There's independent media, real accountability, the civil society. The greater danger for Ukraine over the next decade is governance. And I'm specifically talking about balance of power across the branches of the Ukrainian government. Right now, most Ukrainian governing power is concentrated in the office of the president, which doesn't have regulations limiting any of its authorities. Ministers can serve as figureheads curated by Yermak's deputies, who use the security and enforcement apparatus as they please at times. If a minister starts developing their own independent power base, like Kubrikov does, they're gone. Their ministry might be chopped up. The Rada kind of takes a lot of influence from the office of the president. Ukrainian civil society, the most fearsome civil society in the world, they know this, they get this, they're working on it, but they need our help on these issues over the next decade. They think their best hope is getting real checks and balances through conditionality in the EU enlargement process. But then when I ask officials in Brussels, they regret to inform me that that's not on track to happen. I mean, it's not part of the acquis, so it won't happen naturally. There's a chapter on functioning of democratic institutions, but it's not going to have opening benchmarks. It's really just a safeguard to prevent backsliding a la Georgia or Turkey. So question for you is, how can the United States and Europe press Ukraine to get serious about balance of power, that foundation of freedom, as they have with anti-corruption over the past decade?
Wow, how much time does everybody have? So, as you rightly point out, and recent surveys have indicated, very recent surveys, that the number one priority for the Ukrainian people is not winning the war, but it's making sure that the corruption is defeated. The reform agenda remains a top priority, because what are they fighting for, right? And that, to me, is both powerful and important and resonant. So I will... on conditionality, I'll just touch on that briefly. With the direct budget support that we provided, the United States, that you all provided, to help shore up the economy and enable Ukraine to continue to fight on the second front, which was the economic front that Putin was trying to dismantle as well. We did impose conditionality and on the reform agenda specific to anti-corruption. And whether the power is centralized in Bankova right now or not, the fact that Zelensky and Yermak and their ministers recognized the importance of that, and it wasn't just about getting the money, but that the people were demanding it. And they passed, since February of 2022, a whole slew of reform legislation that had been languishing and not moving forward. So that commitment is there. The next test and step, and this is where my team and we are focused, laser focused, is implementation. And implementation not just at the national level, but more importantly, or most importantly, at the local level, where the people can see, touch, and feel and know that they have confidence in their local government, in their community, and that the flow of whether resources or information from where they are back to Kyiv is protected, and that they can have confidence in whether we move to recovery and reconstruction, et cetera, but that faith in the governance structure and that social contract remains strong. We had, before February of 2022, tremendous success in, it wasn't big bang decentralization that we've done in other places, but since 2014, decentralization and local governance was a key element of our portfolio, and that's still strong and robust, and we remind and include and reinforce the importance of local government as part of the decision-making process, whether on the security side, but from our perspective on the economic and reform and the humanitarian side. So it remains a top priority. We still have some tools in our toolkit. I think the biggest carrot, and we may need some sticks at some point, but the biggest carrot is this is what the Ukrainian people want. And what are we all supporting the fight for if we can't help President Zelensky and his team deliver on that demand?
Yeah. The Ukrainian people want this, and they've shown through their civil society that they build what they want to build. So that's coming.
So on civil society, we, so many of you have probably engaged with so many of the Ukrainian civil society groups that we've helped support and are doing heroic work, not just on the traditional, whether it's humanitarian delivery, et cetera, but as watchdogs and providing oversight, but even more importantly, being that touch point for the people and serving that role of engaging with the government at whatever level to be able to make sure that the people's voices are heard. And one civil society leader described it best. This was at Lugano in the first Ukraine Recovery and Reconstruction Conference. We were on a panel together, and she said, look, you all look at us as watchdogs. And that's what we do. That's what we are. We serve. We make sure that everybody stays in line. She's like, but you got to think of us also as sled dogs. Because with us there, we can help you, government of Ukraine, succeed in what you're trying to achieve. And so we're working hard to make sure that that connectivity and that recognition of the powerful role civil society is playing, but can play even more, alive.
Yeah, it is often hard for us to realize, in the West, just how expansive of a role Ukrainian civil society has. They're not just watchdogs. They come up with the ideas and draft the most important legislation in the country. Things that congressional staff or parts of the government would do in most countries. Civil society does that. Then they build the tools and work with the government on implementation. They're amazing.
Yep.
Let's talk about the defense and security sector, which I'll again frame for a minute. Even though defense and security is the most important part right now of the Ukrainian government, half of the state budget, it's almost entirely neglected by all but one of the G7 countries who support reforms in essentially every other sector of Ukrainian governance. There are civil society experts who do oversight of the Ministry of Defense. They build digital tools, support national security governments. They do it mostly in their free time on nights and weekends because they haven't yet figured out how to work with the donors to support defense and security projects. The UK is the one G7 country that runs a program that funds Ukrainian defense governance. They've got well-established parameters and controls to stay within the OECD definition of official development assistance, classification that's been around since the Vietnam War to exclude military purposes. That same term was first written around that same time into the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, prohibiting economic assistance for military or paramilitary purposes. But being the same term, it kind of shows that the Brits and the OECD have shown a path to overcome the same prohibition that USAID faces under U.S. law to deliver governance aid to Ukraine's military sector without it being military assistance. And over the past couple of years, there are a number of allies who've been working hard to try to take another look, see if they can follow suit, even countries that have their own domestic constraints, like the Irish. They've got their neutrality law, but they're working hard. And I understand that you all, too, have been very commendably working hard, continuing to take a look at that issue, and even beginning to encourage Ukrainian implementing partners to bring forward ideas involving military oversight, funding, support from aid to be discussed on a case-by-case basis. Can you talk about that issue at all?
So you're right. We do have a statutory prohibition, and for good reasons. You mentioned Vietnam, and we'll just sort of leave it at that. My agency's evolved since then. That said, what we do to tackle and put the tools in the hands of the government, whatever ministry, is our approach. It's not circumvention, but let's take procurement. Let's take the two sectors in any country that are the most rife for graft or corruption are the defense sector and the health sector. And so when we were working, particularly in an outsized way since 2014, since the first invasion, we helped establish a very transparent, digitized government procurement system, Prozoro. At the same time, civil society, Dozoro, to be able to monitor and make sure that it was adhered to, et cetera. That system is available and is supposed to be, because it's in Ukrainian law, their statutes, to be used by all government ministries. So what we can do to be able to add value to what the Brits are doing, and I'm proud of them for cracking the code, I see some congressional colleagues here. They're probably better situated to see what aperture we can open to enable economic assistance and development assistance, support that. But it's not dual use per se. It's looking at wholesale the tools of government, and then different line ministries can then take advantage of it. Civil society, we don't say, are you dual use? Are you working in the security sector alone? Then we can't help you. So much of the networks in the civil society organizations that we've supported and worked with, were doing human rights, and then they were out here on the Hill asking for HIMARS, right? So the lines have been blurred, and it's important for us to make sure that our funding doesn't go for security assistance, but the good governance, the digitization tools, the transparency and accountability that we build into the macroeconomic assistance to the other work that we're doing is applicable and is intended to be used across sectors, and the security sector can certainly take advantage of that too.
Yeah, great. Let's go to another sector, energy, where you named that as one of the pillars, because aid has rightly been dedicating most resources in Ukraine there. But this is a really long-term project, going back, almost a decade, preparing to unplug Ukraine from its energy grid from Russia and into the EU, as happened in February of 2022. And then during the war, USAID kept the lights on in Ukraine, in the hospitals, in the schools, in the other basic functions, so that the Ukrainians can then fight on the front lines. And it continues to evolve over the past year as Russia is degrading Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and energy generation capacity. The priorities have rightly shifted to protective measures. I'm not sure how widely understood that good story is, and the fact that funding that aid is sending to Ukraine is so heavily concentrated in this area that the Ukrainians are living and dying by the need to keep the warmth and the lights on in the cities. Can you talk about that work?
Sure. It is not, I would say, the majority of the economic assistance, but not the lion's share.
Okay.
Definitely a significant portion, because it undergirds having access to electricity, power, keeping the lights on, the heat going, water running. You need electricity to run the pumps, is vital for basic survival and economic activity and fighting the war, et cetera. I mean, it's fundamental. And I just want to touch base on the point that you made about the work that we've done since 2014, almost a decade, to get ready for integration with the EU, unplugging from the Russian grid. So that was supposed to be a test pilot. It was both Moldova and Ukraine on February 23rd. Okay? Take them off the grid, hope it works, and we never had to restore it. Miraculous. Right. And so we were able to remove a critical tool from Putin's hands. That's why he's firing so many missiles and drones and attacking the civilian infrastructure, as well as threatening Moldova and, frankly, the rest of Europe for that reason. We didn't wholesale abandon our long-term energy efforts. And a lot of the work that we were doing was what I would call the software, right? The regulatory reform, what they needed to do to modernize their energy sector, de-kleptify or de-oligarchize. Let's make that a word. De-oligarchize the energy sector, because it is ripe for corruption, and it was and it remains a challenge in terms of single ownership and non-market-based energy generation. And so that work, the regulatory reform, looking at privatization, looking at introduction of economic opportunity and market-based efforts and private sector investment, has not stopped. But we did have to pivot a lot of the longer-term investments that had been earmarked for the, medium and long-term development ends for the emergency response. That said, we never responded in the emergency situation with something that wasn't building that better tomorrow. The auto transformers that we purchased are modern and connecting, whether it's Japan, whether it's Germany, whether it's the United States, those private sector companies with the utility operators and from Uconergo to others, for that future partnership that they're going to need for the long term. And so while we responded in the moment to keep the heat on and the lights going, water running, we're laying that basis for that integrated, decentralized, modern, and diversified energy grid that Ukraine has been working so hard for. And frankly, Putin's just accelerating the process.
Okay. Another area that I know has been a passion for you all and all of us at GMF, as the living memorial to the Marshall Plan, GMF has been a leading proponent of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And I know that AID has similarly viewed it as a pivotal issue, specifically hiring a senior advisor on Ukraine recovery and reconstruction. And, regardless of what happens in politics in the United States and internationally, there's going to be a recovery in Ukraine. I understand that you have worked very hard to ensure that the Bureau is set up to respond to that. So can you talk about AID's work and preparations for current and future recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine?
So a lot of the work has been on the economic front. We don't plan on doing sort of the bricks and mortar. Ukraine should. What we need to do is make sure that access to those supplies, making sure that the quality standards of what they build back better, that's their term. It was ours first, went by the wayside, they picked it up. We don't want to reconstruct what was. This is an opportunity to really build that country of the future that they're fighting so hard for. And so looking at from urban planning to, again, mobilizing the private sector and building up partnerships for close shore countries, whether it's Moldova, Romania, Poland, et cetera, to play that role to help deliver cement, glass, right? Kazakhstan has just opened a glass factory in Moldova in anticipation of the huge orders of glass manufacturing once it's ongoing now just for keeping coverage, but for that restoration and full recovery. Private sector and other foundations have come in as well. I was in Bucha in my second to last trip in May, and it was together with the Buffett Foundation and other partners and a little bit of donor money, taking what was the site of, as you all remember, the most horrific both devastation and human tragedy. And they have transformed Bucha and that main street that we all saw in the media to, it could be a neighborhood in Falls Church, Virginia. I mean, it's, it's not the apartments that were or the less than standard housing. It's beautiful. And everybody is returning and trying to rebuild their lives. And so it's that eye towards mobilizing the private sector, getting the donors and everyone else laying the ground floor. And we aren't waiting for the war to be over. We are moving in and helping rebuild and deliver on what's needed for recovery now at any given moment inside the country. So we will continue to do that work and pull in the partners necessary. United States isn't going to do it alone. Certainly USAID isn't going to do it alone. The Russian sovereign assets, a little bit of that will go a long way, but even what's immobilized with the price tag that we've seen from the most recent World Bank assessment, it's going to take everyone.
Yeah. A lot of the Russian assets would go even further
Correct.
than a little. Yeah, but that's great. Thanks for that. So lastly from me, before we go to Q&A, just a question about how this work is vital to the United States and how you think about going about educating everyday Americans about its importance. This is always an issue that is sometimes challenging in fields of foreign policy and especially foreign assistance. Could not be more important today, especially with regards to sustaining assistance for Ukraine, which is the front line of our entire security architecture, the Berlin Wall, the Normandy beaches, of today. But, unlike then, we don't even have to put U.S. troops in harm's way to hold it all together. We each have our own way of answering this question. I would imagine that the answer becomes even more compelling and direct with the way that you've set up USAID's work to play an essential role in national security policy in Europe and Eurasia, countering malign influence, building better markets we can trade with. But would love to hear your take on that. How aids national security work in Europe and Eurasia benefits all Americans?
So I think I would characterize it, because I could go on and unpack it sub-region by sub-region, a little different in the Caucasus, a little different in the Balkans, certainly first and foremost in Ukraine. But what it's about is about the power of partnership and American leadership. Ramstein and the security assistance, we convened, we leaned in, we delivered, others followed. Ukraine Agricultural Resilience Initiative, everyone said, oh my, get out the grain. What are we going to do to, Putin's blockaded the ports in Odessa, and Ukraine it's not only vital for their economy, but for global food security. What do we do? And so we worked hard to demonstrate what not only could be done, but not only what should be done, but what could be done. Mm-hmm. And that practicality being sort of that first mover, others joined, funded, followed. And so my point about why it matters in Ukraine, because the fact that any nation thinks it's okay to violate sovereign borders, steal children, mm-hmm. weaponize winter, choke off the food supply for countries that are starving and dependent on Ukrainian grain, weaponizing the economy because they wanted to undermine the Ukrainian resilience that we've seen that's so strong. Putin's successful in those actions. Other malign actors, and we talked about a lot of them, will say, oh, it's okay. I can do that too. Mm-hmm. And the 80 years of a rules-based order that we have all adhered to, mostly, but those that are vibrant democracies who believe in human dignity, self-determination, freedom, and prosperity, see the threat. And the threat to our national security is that Putin won't stop at Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And you said, absent, we've been able to do it with foreign assistance. We've been able to engage. We have strong allies and partners, historically strong allies and partners. You mentioned Normandy. Mm-hmm. All of this it's fragile, but we've held it together, is under threat. And if Putin is successful, unfortunately, there would be American boots on the ground. And that is something that an American in the Midwest who couldn't find, well, not Midwest, sorry, I don't want to disparage anybody from the Midwest. An American who's far away from Washington or New York, or, who doesn't follow the headlines every day, who might not know even where Ukraine sits in the European construct, does not want their son or daughter mm-hmm. to be on the front lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. So let's go to Q&A. I'm sure there are many. Yeah, go ahead and raise your hand. I'll call on you. Introduce yourself, and quick, succinct questions appreciated. I see you right here in the back.
Thank you, Alex Sinevsky, Voice of America. Ambassador, thank you so much. I have two questions. Number one, what was the biggest challenge for you while working in Ukraine? And number two, when the war is over, do you think the USAID is going to open its offices and operations in Russia, as we've been helping them back in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed and they don't have anything to eat, literally? Thank you.
So the biggest challenge has been capacity. Ukraine is short 4.5 million skilled workers right now today to be able to go to work and help building the recovery and restore what they need. Government is stretched. The best intentions to implement the reforms, the staff and what they need in terms of pure personnel, partly because of the huge outflux of refugees, internally IDPs, and frankly, those that have been mobilized on the front lines. And so that is our biggest challenge, is capacity. And helping rebuild and tap into that capacity is a top priority. Upskilling, reskilling, and looking at non-traditional human capital and helping them get to work. On Russia, I don't know.
Yeah.
Moscow was my first post when I joined government back in the 90s. And I had been working there in the private sector beforehand, was a student in the 80s before even before Perestroika and Glasnost and before Gorbachev came into power. And so I've seen Russia through various iterations of itself. We'll see. I would love to be tapped to reopen the USAID mission in Russia. I don't see it happening anytime soon. But miracles can happen.
Great. Yes, seated and back. Yep, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Arthur Kuchetowski, and I'm an institutional sociologist. And I kind of had a question that follows that gentleman's last question. Because you're very macro-focused. You're focused on the entire world, but yet when you speak of Ukraine or different regions, you tie in locally to deal with the subjects, the people, the citizens of these regions of the world. And also towards the end of your last comment a few moments ago, you mentioned those people in the Midwest, those people somewhere trying to reach but don't have access to what we have access in Washington, D.C. to know all this work that you do. And my question is, are there any thoughts of how you're institutionally structured to reach into local communities in American society, or just because we're going through this entire process of globalization, this becomes part of our local government, this becomes part of our local society to know precisely what you do at USAID, because then we could make accurate determinations as to how we lead our leaders and have impact on the policies that you were speaking of in terms of Ukraine.
That's a great point, and I recognize that gap. Our USAID's greatest strength is our ground game and our field presence overseas. There are some prohibitions in terms of our ability to sort of advertise and amplify our work domestically. Certainly overseas, that isn't in place. But I have threaded the needle a bit, and many members of, or my counterparts for other regions, Africa, Asia, Latin America, have done the same, and that is reaching out to diaspora communities here in the United States to help amplify, answer their questions on what we're doing, but also garner, particularly in the case of Ukraine, the outsized interest in how can I help, and helping making those connections with the civil society organizations inside Ukraine or other partners so that they have an outlet for whether it's philanthropy or a desire to train or not just provide, humanitarian relief, but help in some way. And so that connectivity, I think, has upped awareness of what we're doing. And it's events like this where I can have conversations with you and share what we're doing that help. But we, unfortunately, aren't allowed to sort of whistle-stop grandstand tour around the United States to let everybody know on a regular basis what our work is doing. We have to get at it from different angles. But it's a great point. And again, for our legislative branch colleagues in the room, that's something that I offer up for your consideration.
When you said whistle stop, I couldn't help but think that we suffer no such constraints at GMF, and we have our whistle stop tour where we go all throughout the Midwest and talk about agriculture and all the benefits of supporting Ukraine, and that has been a real impactful and inspiring journey for all of us. Other questions? Okay, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jason Hutchison. I'm a partner with Light Global Advisors. We're focused on helping companies enter and operate in Ukraine.
Great.
And it's really been inspiring to see how much the U.S. government has mobilized across defense and diplomacy and development for Ukraine. Certainly, our technical assistance there has been wide-reaching. Some of the problems that we've seen are that we often end up with contracts on the defense and development side that are too big to fail, and some of our infrastructure things get hung up on regulatory differences between what's a technical assistance component, what's an A&E component, and you end up with generators that are in warehouses and not hooked up or things like that. If you're looking towards the next Congress and towards the next administration, what are some pieces of advice that you would have for them for how they can facilitate faster and more efficient delivery on some of that assistance where we have run into our own feet as we're trying to deliver?
That's a great question. The last thing we want is any of the support equipment. Auto transformers. Has anybody ever seen an auto transformer? They're about as big as this room. and massively heavy, so when we're asked, why can't you get 18 more auto transformers? It's not like anybody keeps them in their cupboard. And so I would answer, broaden the opportunity for partnerships and being able to source where we can move more quickly. That wasn't an obstacle, but of course we always look first to whether it's GE or other US companies, manufacturers, and if they aren't compatible, what it would take to retrofit, et cetera. And then we've, lo and behold, through that search, GE Hungary had auto transformers that were able to be compatible with the grid. And so it just takes a bit of homework. I think it would be more expectation management in terms of time. That takes time. And frankly, in the moment and needing to respond so quickly and deliver what we could so quickly, we didn't have the, I don't want to say luxury of time, but you have to trade those priorities. We have found it extraordinarily effective and are moving so much of our work more to local partners. And whether from civil society to Ukrainian businesses and others, to partner with U.S. businesses because they're on the ground, know the needs, and can deliver as quickly as possible. In terms of specifications, whether it's on construction, in the energy sector, rail, et cetera, the good news is all of the donors, whether it's from Australia and Japan and Korea to the EU and the United States, UK, it's Canada, et cetera, we have one set of standards now. With the EU accession path or EU candidacy path, it's what do we need to do to make sure Ukraine is aligned with and connected with the EU. And so that's where we start, and that's where we need to focus.
In the corner, patient gentleman.
Lev Zinchenko, Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, and my question is rather general for you. What should Ukraine do so it doesn't follow Georgia's scenario concerning democratic backsliding, and Russian influence within the country? Maybe on the other fronts as well. So that's my question for you.
Stay the course, demand implementation of the reform agenda, institutionalize the anti-corruption bodies that we have worked so hard to build and capacitate, whether it's NABU, SAPO. Don't take, and this is for everyone in the audience, when the Ukrainians identify a government official who is corrupt and arrest them, everybody's like, oh, we told you Ukraine's corrupt. No, it's that the system is working, and that's a good thing. Celebrate that identification. Human beings, unfortunately, even Ukrainians, with how heroic and resilient you've been, everybody's human, and some people are just bad actors. And so it's okay to catch them, and it's really good when they do. And so we need to, rather than say, aha, I told you so, Ukraine's still corrupt, to say, no, actually, the system is working, and there are consequences for stealing from the people. And so I would keep that up. Don't let, the other piece of advice would be, don't pass laws that don't reflect Ukrainian values and what Ukraine is fighting so hard for. The power of partnership is real. It's not about foreign agents. It's about partners from around the world who want to help Ukraine succeed. Inclusivity is critical because every member of society has a right to exercise their voice, their will, to work and to live. Human dignity is at the heart of that. Family values, looking at things that put people into categories or keep vulnerable populations down, has no place in the future Ukraine that we're fighting for.
Good
That's
question.
my advice.
It's a good question. Good answer. Yes, right here.
Hi, how are you? I'm Penny Knotts. I'm with GMF and I work on economic issues here. So I've done a lot of work in my past life with AID, particularly on economic empowerment. So I just want to thank and applaud AID for a lot of the work they're doing on that, particularly with regards to Indigenous, gender, a wide variety of making sure that economic empowerment is inclusive. I have two questions for you. One you may not want to answer, but one is on technical standards and regulations. So there's a lot of talk about how the desire is for Ukraine to become more closely aligned with the European market, maybe even be considered for European Union membership someday. And I'm just curious how AID thinks about that when it also comes to commercial opportunities for US firms going into Ukraine, if it's going to be on European standards, European technical regulations, terms, and how you work through that to make sure that it's an open environment for US companies as well. And my second question I was going to ask you, because you have Europe, is about Greenland. And if you have any insights with regards to your work on Greenland, because I know AID has given some money to Greenland in the past for some work, and if you have any thoughts, given that Greenland is in the news, about Greenland.
Yes, so my remit, to be clear, is from the Caucasus to Greenland. That's right. I'll answer your last question first, and then we can get to standards in a second. But we opened up an office when the consulate, when the State Department opened up a consulate in Nuuk, in Greenland. AID was invited to join because the economic connectivity and opportunity that they saw that AID could bring was top of the list. We are still there. I have an officer there, and it's focused on the trade opportunities and economic opportunity between the United States and Greenland in particular. Fishing. First commercial flight, I think, started, United, Newark to Nuuk. It used to take 3 days to get to Greenland, but now you can get there in a day. And so that connectivity is a really good thing. American presence is vital because if we're not there, others will be. Greenland is resource rich, particularly in rare earth minerals, and we would love to consider ourselves as a beachhead for American companies, mining companies, extractives, tech sector, to be able to look at business opportunities there. I think the whole population is like 55,000 people. I mean, it's it's expeditionary. If you go to Nuuk, I applaud you. I have not been, but the importance of presence and being in a place that has come under the spotlight for strategic competition remains valid and important. On standards, private sector is very good at adapting and entering markets. The AmCham in Ukraine is large and robust. It's not a greenfield opportunity for American business. American business is there. I would love to see more American business there. But that it's not a barrier. And Ukraine's EU candidacy, along with Moldova's EU candidacy when they were announced at the same time, are something that we wholesale support and expect and have already seen the private sector behind us.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more question, if there's a last one.
See there.
Oh, yes, right here, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm a Fulbright from Canada. I was used to work for our Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, on the Ukraine file, so thank you for all the work you're doing. You rightly point out that the Caucasus and the Balkans are obviously a bit of a different regional perspective, but Moldova and Ukraine are pocketed together, and when the fighting does eventually stop in terms of their path to the EU and the kind of reforms that both of them need in protection from Russian aggression and other authoritarian powers. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about interlinkages that we could connect with the two in terms of a more whole of government, whole of region, for lack of a better term, because they're not a region, but they're two countries that are very vital to ensuring that authoritarian powers don't creep into Europe. And they were both announced at the same time on the EU path. So I'm wondering if there's any policy linkages that we could do in that kind of area. Thank you.
So that's a great question, and we put them together, and you could have been President Sandu saying, making the point, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, nothing about Moldova without Moldova, and nothing about them together. Moldova's proximity to Ukraine, and it was so frustrating for security reasons. I was down in the south and I could see Odessa. I could see it. And I had to take a plane to Poland and a train, and like 2 days later, finally get to Kyiv. And so that connectivity, that proximity, and the opportunity that we see for them together is clear. And there is no executive branch agency that I've been working with that doesn't agree. Moldova also wants to position itself from an economic opportunity perspective as the hub for Ukraine recovery and reconstruction. And this is something that we announced when I was at the Moldova Partnership Platform. When was that, Isabel? September. Sorry, dog years, right? In September, we announced an additional amount from the supplemental, the National Security Supplemental, for that purpose for Moldova. And so we are keen to continue to invest in that partnership, those linkages, because we see them as intrinsically part of a whole. So couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank all of you for being here. That's the time we have, and most of all, thank you, Erin, for your leadership on such important work, national security work that's been, a time when it has been needed by the United States, by Ukraine, by Europe, by the world. We all very much appreciate your service.
You.
So.
Thank you.
All right.